Hey everybody, thank you so much for joining us for another Colorado Sun political event, Colorado Sun event. I'm Jesse Paul, the Colorado Sun's political editor and a reporter here at the Colorado Sun. And I'm joined by some great folks, political correspondent, Colorado Sun political correspondent and data expert, Sandra Fish. I'm pleased to also be joined by 9 News political reporter, Marshall Zelinger, and Colorado Public Radio's Washington correspondent, Caitlyn Kim. These are some folks I really respect in the journalism field here in Colorado. Love to follow their work. Always get excited when I get to see them out on the campaign trail. And I especially want to thank Fish and Caitlyn, who are joining us from vacation, which I'm very jealous of. Marshall is live on air right now on 9 News, so he's going to join us in about 10 minutes. The guy works pretty hard, so he's got a lot to cover, and we're excited to kind of get his perspective in here. I want to start off also by thanking our sponsor for tonight, Ponte and Busam Public Affairs Consultants. And finally, I want to remind everyone, to become a Colorado Sun member if you're not already a Colorado Sun member. And if you want to become a premium member, you can get the unaffiliated newsletter, which is our twice weekly politics, kind of peeling back the curtain newsletter that Fish and I work really hard on. Lots of data analysis in there and stuff that you can't find anywhere else. We work really hard to put that together and try to make our competitors' heads explode a little bit with it. But tonight we're all friends, and so I'm excited to hear from these folks kind of what they saw, because it was quite an interesting election cycle with a lot of surprises and twists and turns. So kind of before we get started, and I promised people I would do this, so I think it's important and a good timing. We're a week out from Election Day, obviously, but more than a week. And the 3rd district race between Lauren Boebert and Adam Frisch hasn't been called yet. And we had a lot of movement today. 11:59 p.m. last night was the deadline by which people had to turn in their ballots. And whether these were cured ballots or military overseas, a little bit wonky. You can read about that on our site. But as of now, the deal is that Lauren Boebert is up by 551 votes, and there are 3 counties in the 27-county 3rd Congressional District that have not finished counting. And those 3 counties, I'm going to read this so I make sure I get it 100% right, are Otero, San Juan, and Moffett. And Otero is the biggest of the 3, and we called all the county clerks there, and they told us that combined, they have about 200 ballots left. So if you do the math, that's not enough ballots in any situation for Adam Frisch to catch up to Lauren Boebert. But the caveat here is that, one, there can be election surprises, as all of us know very well. Ballots can be found or whatever, or lawsuits. And then secondarily, obviously, this is going to probably, we don't see any situation in which this doesn't head to a mandatory recount. So the race is still kind of ongoing, but that's where things stand. Assuming that what the clerks told us is accurate, and that the counties that have reported being done are actually done, that's where the things are going to wind up. Assuming Frisch gets all 200 of those votes that are left, he'd still be about 300 down by tomorrow night when the counting has to stop. So this is going to drag on for a few weeks, we think, and it'll be pretty interesting. So of all the people who kind of covered the 3rd Congressional District race the best, it's the Washington correspondent, who was always traveling around CD3. So Caitlyn, I want to start with you. You covered this district inside and out. You were driving around talking to a ton of voters. And I'm wondering what you can tell us about what you heard, since this outcome really surprised, so many of us. Uh-oh, we got you still muted.
Sorry, there you go. Can you hear me now? I think this outcome shocked pretty much everyone, including people who were hoping for this outcome. I had heard some rumblings that this might be closer than comfort for Boebert, and I had sort of made some calls and talked to a bunch of people, like Democrats and unaffiliated, about is it going to be really close? And everyone thought no, for a lot of different reasons, and they sort of rattled them off, which everybody's been covering, right? +9. Republican lean, the fact that this was the atmosphere and the history favored Republicans going into the cycle, and just the fact that, for Boebert, as we all know, people either love her or hate her. There's no in between, and that sort of, I've always found people more people love her than hate her when I've been talking to people out in that district, although people do not appreciate the way she's behaved in Congress. So I kind of, we'd seen, I think, Jesse, you were on that press conference when they had the the Frisch campaign put out the polling that showed that he's within striking distance, and that
Right.
her unfavorables with unaffiliateds were that she was losing unaffiliateds. So it was one of these things where you just sort of looked at it, and you talk to a lot of people, you talk to as many people as you can, but it's still like, I feel like we've been in this situation before, especially with the primary, where we had this sort of, oh, all these Democrats are going to be unaffiliated to vote in the primary to support quorum. So basically, like everybody else, I was caught surprised by this. And now that I've had time to think about it, I think part of the thing I thought about is like, I just stressed it, right? +9 Republican district, but it's still only like, on the one hand, it's also +9. That's like the third most competitive congressional district in Colorado after the 8th, the 7th, and then you've got the 3rd. This is not like Buck's 4th, where he's like over 26% Republican lean, or even, Lamborn with over 20%, like 9% with the right Democratic candidate and the right sort of atmosphere. It is winnable for Democrats. And I think, like a lot of other reporters, just given the atmosphere, I maybe not discounted it, but I think, talking to a lot of people, I didn't see that sort of groundswell that apparently was there. And for me, the big question, I think, and this is something for, you and Fish and Marshall when he gets back on the call, I wonder what this, like, is this a signal to Boebert to change her ways or not? And, for most people with a race that's going to be going into a recount and less than 500 or just over 500 votes would be like, hey, you might want to tone things down. I kind of wonder if that's the message she gets from this or not.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I've seen a lot of Republicans like asking that same question. People maybe who aren't, the biggest Boebert fans, about whether or not this is a message sent to her. And like, obviously, every election's a referendum, and I think it's there are other factors that like Fish and I have looked at. Turnout was a little bit down in CD3. Obviously, this was a bad year for Democrats or for Republicans across the state. But at the same time, like, I think it's, what is Lauren Boebert known for? It's the things in Congress that, she gets headlines for that we write about all the time. And I have here and I wanted to unpack the Keating poll, because you and I were on that call, and I would call myself a healthy skeptic of what was going to happen in CD3. And I think, there's always election surprises, but, from what I know, like Republican +9, that's hard for a Democrat to overcome. This 3rd district hasn't elected a Republican since 2008.
A Democrat
since 2008. And so the Keating poll was interesting. And I talked to Chris Keating, the Telluride base pollster, afterwards, and said, it's amazing that you got this so right. And he did an excellent job. And but I think the other things that we oftentimes look for in a competitive race is like national money coming in. Didn't happen here. The DCCC like basically said it's not for us. The NRCC didn't come in. So like all of the normal signs that would say that a race is competitive. And again, we talked to voters. It wasn't like, we talked to them too, and they kind of said, people we talked to when Boebert took office still liked her, still hated her. So it was hard for us to kind of gauge exactly what the whole thing is. So Fish, you've obviously had like the most experience here of covering the Colorado races.
I'm old, just say
I didn't say it, but you did. So,
but you're wise. You're wise.
Yeah, I wouldn't go that far either.
But where does this like rank for you in terms of like surprising races or outcomes? Like I know on election night we were looking for a lot of things. This was not one of them.
Yeah, this was not one of them. I think, in a more slower role, I think in 2004.
I'm old.
Hey, Eric, you might want to mute yourself. So I think in 2004, like Democrats in the legislature from Boulder were saying to me before the August primaries that they thought that Democrats could take over the state house for the first time in more than 40 years. It was like a really long time. And Republicans had controlled both. The Democrats had the Senate for 2 years and in 2000. And I think that people they were like, we need the right people to win the primaries in the Republican Party. And they had a slate of more moderate, people that weren't all like abortion rights advocates or not all, wanting to curb gun violence, that sort of thing. And in the end, they won. Republicans kind of came to the realization that Democrats were going to win both the House and the Senate in October. And if you're an aficionado of Colorado politics and haven't read the blueprint by Rob Whitwer and Adam Schrager, you really should, because 2004 was when really Democrats got their financial house in order, but also a collaboration among a bunch of different groups to work on funding these elections and doing the outside money thing. And they were successful, and they've pretty much been that way for a while.
Yeah. So I guess a reminder, I forgot to say this at the top, but if you do have questions for any of us, you can email them over to questions@coloradosun.com. And I get like a feed that pops up right on my computer. So it's pretty cool. One of the questions is actually pretty interesting. And I think we can kind of dive into this because it has a little to do with the CD3 race. But this reader wants to know, can you discuss the role of third parties in the 8th Congressional District and legislative races? Was there a third party candidate in CD3? So in CD3, there was not a third party candidate. There were write-in candidates. You have to like file to be a write-in candidate. So you can't, if you want the votes to count for you, you actually have to file. In the 8th Congressional District, there was a Libertarian candidate who, bridged the margin, I think more than it by a lot. There's been some interesting reporting by Marshall's people over at 9. I know Kyle Clark has done it. I saw him pop in for a second. Maybe we can grab him to talk about it.
I'm back. Sorry, I'm back.
Did you write about the third party candidate in CD8, or was that mostly Kyle?
Kyle did that, but I know about it.
Yeah, can you talk about it a little bit?
So the rumor out there, like the day before, was, hey, you should check out why this third party candidate, Libertarian candidate, suddenly got more votes than any other Libertarian candidate in any other race. Was it Democratic meddling, trying to get Republican voters to vote for the Libertarian instead? And he found that the Libertarian was a sound guy for like a heavy metal group that would play a song during concerts called Shut the F Up, and that was like his anthem, and the group would tell the people in the crowd, vote for this guy, and that was his outreach. And if you learn about him, he called himself a libertarian socialist, so he's like anything but a Republican. Like if you were not going to vote Republican, you probably weren't going to vote for this guy. So the idea that it was Democratic meddling turns out to perhaps, maybe that happened door to door in certain spots, but it seems like this guy's got support from concerts where a heavy metal group said, vote for this guy. And they did. And it may have made the difference. But like I said, libertarian socialist versus Republican, I don't think it's like, I like that. Maybe I'll just do this one instead.
Yeah. And I think it's important to mention that the Republican candidate, Barbara Kirkmeyer, has like a long, people know her well in Weld County, and there are certainly people who have maybe, there are Republicans who are not super in favor of her, right? And so that could maybe explain some of it. And again, like I haven't seen great exit polling there, and so I don't want to say definitively. And then in terms of the legislative races, there were a few where third-party candidates bridged the vote margin, and we're going to have some stuff on that in the unaffiliated tomorrow. And then I guess before we move on to the next one, I forgot you have some breaking. You want to break some news? Break some news.
It shouldn't be a surprise, but about 2 hours ago, 2 years from now, we're going to do it all again in the third CD, because 2 hours ago, Adam Fish filed to run in 2024. And I think, wise move. He can get a ton of momentum with money by doing this now and, starting to, get voters out there. Hey, we came close this time. And, he's going to get a lot of momentum from doing it now. I haven't seen any actual announcement, but I saw the FEC filing.
Yeah, and I think that allows him to start raising money, for the next campaign and maybe prevent any kind of squishiness. So we'll have to check in with Mr. Fish about what his exact intentions are. So the CD3 race wasn't like the only surprise. Obviously, it was the biggest one. So I want to chat a little bit about those. And I guess I'll dive into the ones that surprised me the most were the gains that Democrats made in the state House and the state Senate. And those were pretty shocking because they flipped like some really Republican seats, talking about, R+8, R+9 districts, Highlands Ranch, like parts of Colorado that I always felt were pretty hardcore Republican. And I know that the Democrats were surprised about this because I talked to them frequently, and they were pretty nervous about election day and what their majorities were like. They thought they might lose the state Senate. There was a chance that was going to happen. And in reality, now they've got larger margins than they've had in a long time. And on top of that, there were some really interesting results that Fish and I have been digging into in terms of specific counties. So El Paso County, for instance, the governor only lost by 4 percentage points. That's shocking, in a Republican stronghold. In Douglas County, Polis barely lost. It was less but one percentage point. Marshall almost got a new suit because of it, and I'll let him tell that story. But we've seen this interesting trend line in Colorado and some of these Republican strongholds. And again, this does kind of tie back into the CD3 stuff with just how much Colorado shifted politically. So Marshall, I'll kick it to you. What were some of the surprises that you felt like you saw in this election year, and things that just popped out to you?
Everything you just mentioned, I really thought, in talking with Democrats and Republicans at the state house, I prefer, that's where I can get my hands on stuff, state house, state races more than congressional and federal races, but everyone seemed to be weary. Democrats were weary that they were going to lose ground or lose the Senate. Republicans, I spoke with Colin Larson like a week before the race, and he's poised to become House Minority Leader if he wants, and he gets beat by Tammy Story, who dropped down because she was going to get beat in her Senate race if she stayed based on redistricting. So she dropped down to the House and ran in this competitive race and won. And the fact that they won, Democrats won all those competitive seats, that's surprising. But one thing I noticed in 2018 that I went back and looked at now, the sheriff's races and the clerk's races. In 2018, sheriff's races turned blue and some clerks turned blue. Arapahoe, Adams, primarily for the sheriffs, and even Jefferson for the clerk, I think was red before that. They held blue this time around easily. And before it was kind of shocking, like even certain like sheriff's races, you think even if you're a Democrat, you're like, okay, that's a job that a Republican should probably do. And that flipped in 2018 and held firm. So that shows to me a strengthening Democratic Party. The one outlier which didn't reflect in this is school board races. Like that's where it's like, well, like everything we learned this election is going to be thrown out the door when you have a school board race. School board issues, one thing, school board race, another.
Yeah, it's and it's kind of interesting. Like when you talk to Democrats, they're not totally willing to admit that Colorado is like a Democratic state yet. They always Michael Bennet or John Hickenlooper or even Polis, like had conversations with them in recent days, and all of them have said, no, it's still, actually, I like what Polis said the best. He said it's an unaffiliated state, which unaffiliateds make up the largest percentage. And I can't tell if that's like maybe to, I don't know, celebrate their wins a little bit more or give themselves a little bit more credit for winning this year. But I think that, it'll be interesting to see whether or not that like that feeling fades away as if they're a state house and they have to think about like which policies are going to pass. Fish, how about you? What was something that you saw this year that surprised you?
I'd agree with the state house. And to an extent, I look at the money, and Republicans, in terms of outside money, really spent a lot on those Republican Senate contests. They paid no attention to some of the seats that flipped, like Colin Larson's. And they also spent a lot of money in the 8th, from the outside groups. Yadira Caraveo raised a lot of money in that contest compared to Barb Kirkmeyer. And I just think that the money difference, it really helps when the candidate raises money. But and Caraveo got help from national Democratic groups, unlike Adam Frisch, but not nearly as much as Barb got. That was a really good race. That was 2 quality candidates from my perspective.
Yeah, and I think Caitlyn, we had talked about like CD8 being an interesting one for you. Talk about what you saw there and what surprised you.
I think what surprised me is that, again, and we've all talked about this, sort of just everyone was feeling sort of bullish about how Republicans were going to do and not so great about how Democrats were going to do. And I think this race was one of those examples. I think most people thought, including myself, that it would be, Kirkmeyer's race to win. As Fish said, there was a lot of outside money supporting her. And she was out on the campaign trail a lot. And I was talking with Republicans, and their polling showed her ahead, so they were pretty confident. So I think that was a surprise for a lot of people. I mean, and I even talked to Democrats out in that district who weren't sure that Caraveo was going to pull it off, mainly because even though she, cleared the primary field early, she wasn't out there campaigning as much as I think Kirkmeyer was from the primary, and then August, July, August, September. I think the other surprise for me, and this is like a very sort of in the weeds thing, was just how well Michael Bennet did in that Senate race. I mean, he double-digit lead over Joe O'Dea, and talking to a lot of voters, wasn't necessarily seeing the unaffiliated voters, break O'Dea's way, but I also thought he was a stronger candidate than say Darrell Glenn, and I expected O'Dea to maybe be just bring it a little closer, especially since Bennet, who's never really broken 50%, finally broke 50% in this race pretty strongly. So that kind of surprised me. And going back to, how you started this conversation, Jesse, they might not want to call it a blue state, but I think for me, this sort of signals that, everything that you've all mentioned signals that Colorado is sort of in the blue column, at least for the time being.
Yeah, and I was talking about Polis's margins in El Paso County and Douglas counties. Bennett did well there too. I mean, relatively speaking, for a Democrat, and same with in Adams County, Jefferson County did well in Pueblo. Gardner barely eked out. Gardner won, I think, right in 20. Or Gardner either lost by a very small margin or won by a very small margin in Pueblo in 2020. And so to have Marshall unmuted himself. He wants to say something.
Well, I've got my fancy map has that data from election night. So you you said Gardner. I have it. Hang on. Gardner in Pueblo lost by a fraction.
It was 0.6 of a percentage point.
How do I go full screen? Come on, full screen. He 693 votes. He lost Pueblo by 693 votes.
Right.
And Bennett beat O'Dea by 6,088.
Right. And okay, so Pueblo County, Udall won by less than a point there, 2014. Bennett won by 10 points in 16. Hickenlooper won by less than a point in 2020, and then in 2022, Bennett won by 9 points. So pretty fascinating. And then I think one other thing that's kind of worth mentioning here when we talk about the surprise of how. So I guess this is, I think this is an interesting thing that people are talking about. So first of all, I think everyone expected this to be a tough year for Republicans to win statewide in Colorado, right? We all know it's a Democrat plus 13 state when you look at the Biden numbers. So, people were expecting wins by Polis and Bennett and things like that. The interesting thing was the margin. And I think it surprised even the Democrats who were running those races. I mean, I can tell you that they were thinking maybe half of what they ended up getting. So it's not just, these were surprises that came in for the people actually running it, the Democrats themselves. And then I'll say too, one of the interesting things, in the 8th congressional district, when you looked at exit polling, Global Strategy Group, which did a really good job polling here, it's a Democratic firm, polled in CD8, did an exit poll and showed that, voters were really motivated by abortion, less motivated by economic issues, and that they didn't trust that Republicans were going to do, big things on that. Crime was a weakness for Democrats, but they were able to outrun that because of their stuff on abortion, and so, or their positions on abortion. And so I think, looking at a race like CD8 where Barb Kirkmeyer ran her campaign completely on economic issues and crime, you can see why that race was what it was. And it was super close. I mean, it wasn't a blowout loss for her, but really interesting. And I think those are good observations. So kind of moving forward for the Colorado GOP, I think this is the question everybody's asking, what happens next? Marshall, I know you've been digging a little bit into this. I wonder if you can talk about what people are telling you, or what what happens next for Colorado Republicans.
Well, based on the House Republican caucus meeting that I was at last week, stand your ground. And we heard in the state politics, Richard Holtorf saying things are going to die on the calendar. So they're just going to drag out legislation that they don't like as best as they can by stalling. New House Minority Leader Mike Lynch, said we're going to stand on our principles. And I asked, but voters know what your principles are, and they lessened the number of you in the state house. And all he said was, well, we still have our cost of living and crime and fentanyl problem. And I'm like, okay, but they knew that, and they still didn't vote you in as much as you thought they would. And he said those are still the issues of the day. So, it was kind of talking around the topic. So from the state perspective, it seems like they're going to stand their ground. I thought this might be, look at the Senate race. Darrell Glenn is most known. I worked in Colorado Springs and Pueblo. I know him as a city councilman and a county commissioner. The state knows him as the guy that looked like he was doing a Bowflex commercial when he was running for U.S. Senate. And Joe O'Dea was more of a notable candidate, and I thought he would do better than Glenn. And we could say, oh, you need to take someone who doesn't have a voting record, who's more moderate, perhaps, and that's going to be your Republican of the future. And that was blown out the water with the results. So I don't know the answer other than what I've heard from Republicans, which is we're going to keep doing what Republicans keep doing.
Yeah, and Fish, I know you obviously track money. It's kind of your expertise. What do you think is going to happen on the money front? Like, that's such an important part of politics.
Yeah, on the one hand, Republicans spent more in some of these races, but the candidates had trouble raising money. And, they blame it at the state level. There are a couple of federal lawsuits over the current campaign finance limits. And you can say limiting state lawmakers to $400 per cycle or gubernatorial candidates to $1,250 a cycle is a problem. But Heidi Ganahl had trouble raising money from other people than herself. And so did a lot of these state level candidates. I mean, Joe O'Dea did not raise a ton of money. And
he did give himself a lot of money.
That's true.
So did Heidi Ganahl.
Yeah, and one Republican actually emailed me at one point and said, our donors are STINGY, stingy. And, I don't know how they get back to having the sort of candidates that people are willing to give money to.
Yeah.
Or find the people willing to give money to their candidates. That's a difficult thing. And Democrats have that on their side. Their candidates have tended to raise more money.
And I want to answer a quick reader question before we move to Caitlyn. But so one of the readers wants to know, how do you do exit polling in an all-male state? So it's a good question. So what happens is, similar to other polling, they reach out via text message or phone call and talk to voters and say, hey, have you cast your ballot already? If you have, can I ask you some questions? And again, this is a firm that got Colorado remarkably right this cycle. If anything, they were a little too rosy for Republicans. And so, I feel good about their numbers, and we at the Sun don't report on stuff or talk about stuff that we don't feel good about. So moving on to Caitlyn, I think the most provocative quote I've seen in any story was in Benta's story. Benta Birkeland at CPR was the extinction level event, and I think I've heard that in Republican spheres. What are you hearing? Before you went on vacation, what were you hearing?
I mean, this was the big question. Where does the GOP go from here, especially when they had such a moderate slate, at least statewide, running for office, and they didn't do as well. Going to what Marshall said, I kind of wonder if it's, for me, when I was talking to voters, it wasn't necessarily that they didn't want to support a moderate Republican. I think a lot of people did. They just didn't want to support them now. And I think this is the issue, right? How much baggage does the Republican Party have, nationwide, including in Colorado, where they can get the unaffiliated voters to actually give them a shot, especially after Roe. I don't think a lot of people were willing to, after sort of January 6th and even with the sort of Donald Trump still hanging over the party. For me, I think that was one of the things that held a lot of people that might have given Republicans a chance to go forward, but they didn't because of everything that happened. Yes, that quote was great. I don't know if it's extinction level. I think it is what we've talked about it as well as maybe they start from ground zero again, or maybe even further back. Because you kind of do need a second party. You need a viable second party, I think, or if not more, to sort of get different ideas out there.
I think Democrats.
I'm not sure.
Yeah, I like the governor would say that, I've been talking a lot to the Democrats at the Capitol about like how they move forward, and they want to have like those conversations. And like Marshall and I know at the Capitol, like sometimes it was when it was a split chamber, when Republicans held the Senate in the Colorado Capitol and Democrats held the House. In some ways, it was easier for both parties because they could kind of like the situation, it moderated themselves. Like they knew that they had to work, they couldn't get out ahead of their skis by design. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. I do want to add, just kind of building off of what Fish said. I mean, I think a big issue here for Republicans is, they already had this financial problem. Their fundraising was lackluster this cycle. I don't know how they're going to convince donors to give in 2024, 26 in Colorado. I think that's an issue. Why would you spend money in Colorado when your gubernatorial candidate lost by 20 percentage points? That's going to be a hard ask. And so they're going to have to have amazing fundraising candidates. And then secondarily, I think, there's some pretty good GOP operatives in the state. There's a experienced political class, and you've got people who've run races before. They're not going to come here to run races and candidates too, right? I mean, people just aren't going to, Caitlyn looks like she has something to say, so I'll stop. Yeah.
No, I mean, like, I will say they've got 4 years to sort of rebuild and figure out where they go from here. Like 2024, aside from the congressional races, which will probably be 8 and 3, and then the presidential race, statewide, you've got they're off the hook. So it gives them time to raise money and sort of figure out, candidate wise. So I think the big question is 2026, right? And a lot of that's going to depend on who's the president in 2024, how 4 years of one party rule is gone. I think there are ways for the GOP to sort of make gains, but I think a lot of it will depend on where the party goes from here and how they try to rebuild. And I'm not sure I've heard that conversation yet, at least from the Republicans I spoke with. I think before I went on vacation, it was still kind of a shock to them. So I think that's like over the next couple of months, they've got to figure out where they go. Like, do they still continue the Hispanic outreach? Like really make concerted gains in that effort? Or not? Do they just sort of say, wait till 2024 or 2026 to do it again?
Yeah, and Republicans made like a concerted effort this cycle, especially in state house level, to recruit, female women candidates and then people of color to run for these office, and they all lost. And I think that they were feeling like they wanted to try and match, Democrats in terms of diversity too, and the candidate recruitment was interesting. But we talked about Colin Larson. I think he was the guy who made the extension level quote, right? And he was kind of seen as being like an up and comer in the party. And obviously his career's not over by any means, but losing a competitive race is tough. It's hard to come back from that, and like emotionally it's difficult, and it's difficult just from the perspective of doing it again and having that on your record. Every time you lose, it's something that we write about whenever it comes up. All right, so let's move on to kind of what this all means. So Caitlyn, I think your perspective is probably the most interesting here because none of us work in DC like you do. And obviously, big change today with Nancy Pelosi saying that she's not going to run for leadership again. But with Republicans in control, we've got 2 members of our delegate, well, 3, assuming, that the Lauren Boebert holds on. Again, race hasn't been called yet. What are you expecting in terms of like committee assignments and where our delegation is going to end up in the mix?
I think you're not going to see much change, or at least I say this right now, you never know. When I spoke with Ken Buck and Doug Lamborn, both Republicans, about, what they might want to seek in a Republican controlled House, Lamborn, who's currently the ranking member, I think, in Strat Forces on Armed Services, said he was going to try for the chair of that subcommittee. Ken Buck said he wanted to wait and see, what the majority was, what the sort of the margin was, and what the priorities were. But he's been doing a lot on the Judiciary Committee subcommittee on sort of the big tech stuff, and I imagine he could still do that as well. Lauren Boebert, she's on budget, she's on Natural Resources Committee. She said she wasn't seeking sort of leadership in that. Who knows if that will change after all this? She wanted to focus on the Freedom Caucus, where she's the communications chair. I think it's going to be interesting to see how the Democrats do, because it's a fairly new, they're still kind of young Democrats, right? Like Jason Crow and Joe Neguse. both serving in their third term. This is the first time they'll serve in the minority. And then you've got two brand new members with Brittany Pedersen and Yadira Caraveo. Sort of Diana DeGette is, the dean of the delegation, and she's going to be the sort of the dean of the Democrats, and showing them how to be in the minority. I think the person to watch is Joe Neguse, especially with the news that came out today. So with Pelosi and Hoyer deciding not to run for leadership, that sort of opens up the next generation. And before this announcement, Joe Neguse had sort of put out a letter saying he wanted to run for the Democratic caucus chair. Clyburn is still going to stay on in sort of leadership, so that kind of has one less position if you think of the top three. Hakeem Jeffries, Catherine Clark, and Pete. Oh God, I'm going to blank on his last name right now. I'm going to blame it on the time difference.
Aguilar?
But anyway, thank you, Aguilar. So the question is, I think Pete Aguilar is going to run for the Democratic caucus chair, where he's currently the vice chair. So the question is where Joe Neguse shows up in that leadership mix. But he's the one in the Democratic or in the congressional delegation that's sort of been in the on the leadership track. So it'll be interesting to see where he goes from here. I'd also still probably keep an eye out on Crow. He tried for leadership last time and didn't get it, but we'll see if he tries again this time.
Yeah, obviously Neguse and Crow are super ambitious guys and young, so we'll kind of see where they end up, both impeachment managers, right, at different times. And so and
DeGette, don't forget DeGette.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, that's true. All right. Yeah, I mean, so DeGette won, was this her 12th term in Congress that she just won? Does anyone know off the top of their head? I'll have to look it up.
96. When was the last time the Avalanche made it to the Stanley Cup?
That Marshall might know.
1995, 96. Yep, 96.
Okay.
No, they won in 2001.
The first, the last time or the first time?
The first.
The
first was
one.
96. Second one was 01. So 96.
So it would have been 97 then, because DeGette told me that when after her first swearing in, she got invited to the Avalanche at the White House. Yay, you won the Stanley Cup party. So that's what I remember.
All right, so Marshall, I know you've been following. We talked about this a little bit, like the House GOP leadership elections. I saw you there, but what else, like that, and what else are you gonna be watching closely, kind of in terms of like what does it all mean following up from the election?
Oh, I'm already onto the Denver mayor's race. What does it all mean?
Talk about that.
It's a little uncomfy actually this week with Chris Hansen and Mike Johnston getting into the race, having to explain you've got female and diverse candidates already in the race. Why do you think your voice is needed? I think is what I saw Wanda James tweet out, and it's an excellent question. Like you're kind of saying, I still don't see the best candidate out there in a place that suggests. And I just like that storyline of like white male candidates coming in after the fact versus what does it say about what they think of the current candidates that are out there. But this, I don't know. I'm trying to remember. My first year in Denver was 2010, so I was just ahead of the open election that Hancock won, and I don't remember how like 5-6 major candidates in that one. Maybe I'm misremembering, but just the fact that we have no downtime from an election season. I'm most interested, if that was the question, I can't remember already, looking at, will the Democrats eat themselves? Like, is that the two-party system, progressive versus moderate Democrats, is the only thing that's going to stop the governor or the Democratic leadership from getting what they want? Is it going to be other Democrats? But there's so many of them that they could, I think you can pass something with a dozen Democrats not voting in your favor in the House and 5 of them not voting in your favor in the Senate. So, yep. I mean, maybe that thought process of mine is kind of out the window. But I mean, Alex Burness was great at covering Democratic infighting last year, like eviction legislation, social justice legislation, and that it didn't get anywhere either because of infighting within, let's say, the state Senate, or because they knew the governor wasn't going to sign it anyways. That's kind of where my interest is. And how much is Jared Polis invested in the next 2 years as governor versus running for president?
Yeah, TBD. I guess I'll say one thing on that. Like, talking to him a year ago, like next month, I think he said no way, no how on a Colorado Sun event, and now went on Bill Maher, and I don't know if he like didn't hear the question, but people are not shooting that idea down as much as they used to. So I think it could be in the mix. TBD. In terms of the state house, I think it's really interesting. I agree. I'll be watching very closely to see kind of how like the Democrats try and moderate themselves or don't. They were handed a blank check here, bigger than the one that they had in 2018. How they cash it is super interesting because they don't really have to worry about any of their people being up until any of their majorities being at risk until 2026. So they kind of have 4 years to do whatever they want. And one of the interesting things that's kind of inside baseball about the Capitol is like oftentimes, Republicans paint the governor as being super liberal. I'm not saying he's not, but oftentimes he can be the moderating force on legislation. Like he's got a very heavy legislative hand. We saw that during his first term, much more so than Governor Hickenlooper did. And sometimes, legislation got pared back at his behest, more so than, maybe more moderate Democrat, Leroy Garcia from Pueblo, or, Joanne Janal from Fort Collins, people who are kind of more moderate voices in chambers. Sometimes it's the governor saying, hey, you guys are going too far on this. And it'll be pretty interesting to see how they do self-regulate, or if they do or if they don't. They don't. I don't know. They got a pretty big mandate here, and so I think they have reason to be able to feel confident. Fish, talk about what this all means from your perspective.
Back to my like sort of wonky thing, like we get all excited about elections, but now is when the actual work gets started. And this was one of my frustration with some candidates, was that I just wondered, have you ever been to a public meeting? And it's a lot of work. And these Democrats, like some of the big issues, those big issues that Republicans talked about, like crime and homelessness and drug addiction, those issues are still out there. And they need to find a way as a group. Certainly there are different people who have different ideas about how to solve them, but it's not just them that needs to work on it. They've got to like collaborate with like local governments and maybe find some help from the federal government and try to, these things are really complicated. This is what we elect people to do. And I think that people think, oh, we elected these people, wave a magic wand, baby. That's not, it's really hard work. And I mean, I think all of us spend a lot of time watching it, and it's difficult. I think, Democrats there are some significant problems, and it's going to be tough to find the solutions.
Yeah, let me go to two quick reader questions. Then I had something funny just happen. Marshall, do you know what the number is in terms of turnout this year? One of our readers wanted to know. I think it was
60. This doesn't show it. Yeah, it was 2.5 out of 3.3. Hang on, I'll get it.
Okay. And then there was another one that came in here, and maybe this one's good for you, Caitlyn. A reader said he's concerned that Neguse is the only progressive we have among all the neoliberals. I don't know if you can address that, but I mean, I think Joe Neguse is probably the most like liberal member of the caucus, right? I mean, but
yeah,
both,
well, him and both, I think, to get to a degree. Like, I mean, she's been there forever, so maybe it might not seem as progressive, but he technically is the only one that's a member of the progressive caucus. I don't know. I feel like Neguse is, yes, he's progressive, but he's also like, he's like really a pragmatic lawmaker. Like he can work with sort of the blue dog Democrats. He can work with the problem solvers. He can work with progressives, the Congressional Black Caucus. Like, it's kind of fun. Sometimes I'll just sort of sit in the chamber, like sort of the gallery, and just sort of watch members of the delegation. And it's kind of like, he's a little social butterfly. Like, he talks to all these different people. So yeah. I think that's kind of what one of his strengths as a lawmaker. But I don't know if he's the most, he probably is of this delegation, of the delegation, is the most progressive.
The thing about pragmatism is highly underrated. Some people have it, some people do not. I'll just leave it there.
Pragmatism at the Capitol would be interesting to watch.
66%, 2 out of 3 voters on the button.
Very cool.
Hold on, Marshall, this is the more important question. Did we beat Minnesota? Did Colorado beat Minnesota?
Hang on, Governor and Secretary of State who say that every
here's
other
a good
word.
here's a good thing. So like that to remind like listeners or readers or whatever, but we go to these events repeatedly with the different, people as they're out on the campaign trail. Michael Bennett at like every event would end it by telling people to turn out because he wanted to beat Minnesota's turnout rate. And like I'm newer to covering politics. I think I've been doing it for like 6 years, but like I swear to God, it like never ceases to amaze me how these people go from one event to the next one and say the same exact thing. They're so on message. I couldn't stand in front of a mirror and practice my speech, and be that on message, whether it's like Joe O'Dea saying I'm a contractor, not a politician, Michael Bennett saying I'm, I want to boost turnout over what Amy Klobuchar had in Minnesota. I hear these like it's very interesting. Okay, so moving on to, we've got like 15 minutes here, and I want to make sure I respect everybody's time. So we're talking about one wonky thing we learned, and this was really interesting. I'll start by talking about curing. So ballot curing is like always a thing where people turn in a ballot without their signature or have a mismatched signature from what's on the state's file. They have this 8-day period after the election to cure ballots. And normally this just like happens, but in close races, it gets really important because, like the CD3 one, because it can make a big difference. And so in the 3rd Congressional District, there was a mad dash from Republicans and Democrats flying in from all over the country to try and find these, I don't know, 5,000 or 6,000 voters maybe that had these ballot issues. And so the other day, Elliot Wensler and I, another politics reporter at The Sun, and then Olivia Prenzel, we got the list of ballot cured people who still needed to cure their ballots and started calling them because we knew that they were getting a lot of outreach and we wanted to know what was going on. So anyways, we probably made 200 calls, and I just had a voter texted me back right now. And she just said, I asked like, how are you doing, getting all this outreach. This is a voter from San Miguel County, Telluride area. And she said, alarmed to how much outreach I got to cure the ballot. And we heard that like over and over again from people who were just being extra pressured to get things done. Fish, what was like something wonky you learned this election cycle? For me, it was curing. What was for you?
Apparently you're supposed to live in the district you represent as a state lawmaker, but I'm not sure anybody ever really checks that unless somebody complains about it. And then there's this formal process you can follow by going to district court and saying, we don't think this person lives there. But you've seen just this play out in a variety of different ways.
All right, Caitlyn, something wonky.
I mean, I don't know if it's wonky, but I thought it was kind of fun that Hickenlooper decided to be a poll watcher this election day. Yeah, sorry. Fish is surprised. Yeah, he decided to volunteer as a poll watcher, and you can do that since he wasn't on the ballot, or no one on his family was on the ballot this time. So I just thought it's kind of interesting for a lawmaker to try and sort of be on that side of things.
Yeah. And how about you, Marshall?
Wonky would be the approach of the Republicans who needed the unaffiliated voters and taking like what you think you should do and doing the exact opposite. I mean, clearly with Heidi Ganahl and Danny Moore, it's like if you're going to be the top of the ticket, and that tracker audio that I was given, tracker meaning it was recorded in a public meeting, given to me. Tracker probably was some Democrat, got her to, on record saying something, shared it with me. And she said that quietly, I'm going to be talking to you about these things, but publicly, you're going to hear me talking about crime, cost of living, all the things that Republicans were talking about. And then it just disappeared. And is that wonky? It's not what I expected. And I'm like, when is this gonna, like, that can't be the campaign, because that's not going to win unaffiliated voters. And just all the way to the end. Couldn't believe it.
Republicans were extremely bullish on Heidi Ganahl at the beginning until she launched her campaign. And then when she did, like, you started to kind of see the cracks appear. And people started to question it. Caitlyn, I saw you unmuted yourself, so I'll
well, I think this goes to what Fish was saying. Like, I heard that, like, she, when she started losing money, like, she lost some of sort of the more seasoned political help that she might have had. And like, this goes to the sort of, sometimes you need money to run a campaign and get good people behind you to help you sort of stay on message and find a good message.
Yeah, and there was some turnover on her campaign, and then Marshall and I, on the first day she launched her campaign, I went to her event down in Monument and asked her, the first question I said was, did you think that the 2020 election was stolen? and she answered it by saying, "I'm not going to answer that question." And she gave the same response to Marshall. And to me, it was an interesting moment because it was a interesting response for someone running in a Democratic state. Obviously, there's no proof that the 2020 election was stolen. That's been debunked. So why not just come out and say it? Because it feels like that's a way to maybe to get all voters, right? That's a view that you might be able to win on. The other one, it's just an interesting first day thing to have that stumble, not be prepared for that question. Yeah, it was kind of fascinating. I had another thing that I wanted to talk about, but I had a question for a reader that's also my editor. This is for this is for Fish. With the Boebert race going to an automatic recount, has a recount ever changed the result of any race in recent memory? I can't remember one. Can you?
My recollection, I don't know of one. There may be some at the really local level where it's like 600 voters or something, a really micro level. But I mean, I just look at the recounts that they did that were paid for, Tina Peters statewide, and then some legislative and other stuff in El Paso. And they just did not change hardly at all, like a handful of votes. I mean, I just think that's a hard one. And I'm sure they'll have lawyers just watching over every moment of this because the lawyers are here. So.
Hey, Marshall, a couple of years ago, there was a race. It was like a Thornton City Council race that came down to a card do you remember this? A card being drawn? Like it was a direct tie. And I feel like if anybody covered it.
Yeah, or no, well, was it so I remember Elbert County had one that was one off. Yeah, no, I remember El Paso County, I think.
Okay.
Wherever it was, it's just a game of chance. Like the options are plentiful of what you can do. You can pick a card, you can rock, paper, scissors, I guess. That's chance. Like I'm thinking of a number
Toss
between 1 and 10.
Flip a coin. Yeah, that was in Virginia.
Yeah, flip a coin. My favorite would be I'm thinking of a number between 1 and 10. What do you say? No, okay, yeah, you got it right. But that would be if it was tied. What I reported on Next Tonight, I'm gonna put it on Twitter, is what changes in a recount. People are thinking, oh, let's just get it within the automatic recount and something's gonna change. No, you're gonna have like a handful of votes that perhaps change because it's the votes that were the voter that either crossed something out and then circled somewhere else. And when it was reviewed by the two election workers of opposing parties, they came to a conclusion that maybe it didn't count, or maybe they missed the smallest of marks that shows voter intent. And so the first time it didn't count, and now those are the ballots that are going to get scrutinized in a recount. I did the data on Monday, Fish, and I counted 6,200 or so. There were two counties that weren't clear, but about 6,200 undervotes. That could mean they just completely left it blank, and that's an undervote because you could choose one and you chose none. Or an undervote could be maybe they underlined Frisch's name or circled Boebert's name. And when the election workers, the machine kicks it to the election workers, hey, something's funny here. They look at it and they're like, well, that's not a circle. That's not a bubbled circle. So we're going to not count that. Now in a recount, you can be damn sure that the attorneys are like, that is clear voter intent. Sure, they didn't fill in the bubble like they should have, but circling the name should have counted. And so those are where you're going to see, those are the ballots that would change a race. So instead of losing by 500 and we're 551 again now. I thought we were 543. Did it change again?
So it went down. San Juan County told us they were going to count, and that's pretty democratic. I think they had like 19. So it went down to 543, but I haven't seen if it went back up.
My database is showing 551 now. But anyways, so instead of 551, it'll be 550. Or 553, like that's what we're talking about. So getting into the automatic recount territory is not going to be this scary moment for Boebert or this, oh, we did it for Frisch. Like it's going to be minimal. The recount's going to change. If you won by 5, I'd be worried that there might be enough in there to, oh boy.
Yeah, and we had a recount this year. We had a statewide race recount in the Secretary of State's race, paid for by Tina Peters, and I think it didn't change anything, right? I mean, there was some more
a net gain, net loss, and it was a wash or something like that.
It was a wash. And so, again, this is a closer margin. She was losing by like 90,000 votes. Here, we're talking about 500. But it's hard to I'm told 5:43 right now by the editor who asked the question.
Oh, can I throw one other weird,
Yeah.
wonky thing that I just want to bring up because I was reviewing it today? This predates the general election, but the moment you and I both had with My Pillow guy at
Oh
the
yes.
rally ahead of the Republican primary, where we were the stupid journalists asking stupid questions that have real power behind why we were asking those questions, asking his relationship with Tina Peters, how much did he give to Tina Peters, and how we were stupid to ask those questions. But that could spell bad news for Tina Peters, because I think my reporting was, if it's true what he gave, she would be fined like 1.8 million or some ridiculous number is the maximum fine. So like, okay, that was a stupid question, was it? Look what you just admitted on camera.
I
That
don't want
you
to.
helped her perhaps violate state law.
Yeah, and that was, I remember that moment. Honestly, that seems like a year ago, but it was an interesting one, to have he's, I'm a small person. He's a large man yelling at me in my face, calling me a stupid person. That was interesting. Yeah. So I guess why don't we end with this is kind of I think a fun thing to end with. Speaking of interesting moments, I want everyone to go around just talk about like their favorite moment on the campaign trail, because we get to do a lot of fun things like you know we went up to going up to Camp Hale was interesting, or going to, talking to voters, seeing, I've been to interesting restaurants and things like that. Um, Marshall, maybe I'll put you on the spot first, because you missed a lot of the campaign trail because you had a baby, which congrats.
Thank you. That's not exactly why. I mean, yeah, that assisted in why I missed, but a lot of what I do doesn't. I am jealous and also thankful that I don't have to do what you guys do, where you're out there on the weekends or out there like in the nitty gritty. Two quick answers to that. I interviewed Yadira Caraveo when she announced that she was running. I think that was 5 years ago. No, but it was a year ago, and I was putting the microphone on her, and I have a little windscreen on the microphone. It was a little foam piece that goes over this. And as I'm putting it on her, or maybe it was actually this, because I took this off to reverse how I put the clip on so that it clipped the right way. And this little windscreen, I let go, and it bounces in her backyard, bounces on her porch, and passed through a grate into her window well, filled with leaves, never to be seen again. Not that it's that big of a deal, but I'm like, of all, like, how did this happen? Like, that's a weird thing that sticks in my head. One of the more recent things I thought during our debate with our Senate debate with Bennett and O'Day, there were two moments, because Bennett's a pretty dry guy, and there's two moments that he was actually funny, where Joe O'Day's getting ready to ask a question to Bennett, and he's like, "Mr. Bennett," and he just stops for a second. He's like, "You can call me Michael," and like it lightens the mood for a minute. But then the second was, we were running out of time toward the end, and we were trying to hit a certain mark so that they had enough time for closings, so that we aren't cutting them off at the end. And it was great that Bennett's answer was, it was about water. I agree with everything that Joe O'Day just said. I agree with it. There's nothing I can say. And so there's going to be a quick follow-up by Luigi from Colorado Politics. And Bennett interrupts, and he's like, "But I've got 45 more seconds I'm going to use anyways."
I got to say, I did my first debates this year, and those are scary. Like all of you guys, we all did ones this cycle, and they're kind of freaky. All right, Caitlyn, I want to hear yours because you traveled to most places. I got to get a prop for mine, so I'm listening, but I'll be right back.
All right. So the most memorable was mainly because it was like the thing that you don't want to happen. I was during the primary, my laptop crapped out on me primary evening, Democratic primary evening. I was Montrose. I couldn't my laptop was gone to pieces. I had like audio that I had wanted to download. It was like horrible. And I just remember sitting outside of this motel on my little iPad, which is what I have here, trying to write a script, being like, I can't get you the audio, but this is what they were saying. And just sitting outside, because that was the only place I could also get Wi-Fi in this entire complex. So the glamorous life of a political reporter, sitting outside of a motel from like 9 p.m. to 11 p.m. because this is the one spot where you can get Wi-Fi. That said, the next day I had the best bear paw bread thing I've ever had in my life in Montrose. If you ever get there, I will happily tell you the place. You just have to send me one in Washington, D.C. I mean, honestly, the most memorable thing for me is just talking to voters. It's great to sort of like especially when you find like that gem, like someone who's a character who has a lot to say, has just a great story, and like you end up talking to them for like 45 minutes and it only feels like 5. Those are always the great things for me that I enjoy.
Yeah, and that's the best kind of reporting. I just have a ton of respect for you for doing that, because I wish I could talk to more. Fish, what about you?
You know, the sweetest thing was going to Representative Ed Perlmutter's final Government in the Grocery. I'd been to his first one after the Gabby Giffords shooting 10 years ago, and to go to his last, and Senator Bennett showed up to surprise him. And then I got the joy of listening to Senator Bennett spend like 10 minutes with this constituent who really disliked the IRS hirings in the bill, and just they went back and forth and back and forth, and Bennett's trying to explain to him that these jobs will not be auditing him, they will be answering the phone should he desire to not be on hold forever. But it was that's where government kind of happens too, is when people get together with their constituents.
All right, and for me, like this election cycle was tough because you got to work a lot of weekends and go out and talk to people, and a lot of times it's in like county party offices, and they're not very fun. But there was a Saturday in Boulder, or maybe it was a Sunday. I went with Michael Bennett to Upslope Brewing, and I was like, got there a little early, so I was going around and looking, and they had a beer that really caught my eye, and so I got a bunch of them. And this is my last one actually, so I'm gonna open it. The Blackberry Lemon Sour from Upslope Brewing. So it was a nice thing. I had to bring a bunch back for my wife. Now I'm drinking the final one that I bought for her, so I'm gonna have words over that. But anyways, we'll wrap up the event here. I just want to say thank you guys so much for joining. That was super fun to chat with all of you, and I've obviously a ton of respect for all the folks on the call. Yeah, so let me wrap up. I gotta give my official spiel. So thank you guys for joining. Thanks to everyone who's on here. Please become a Colorado Sun member. Help us make more events like this possible. Super easy at coloradosun.com/join. Sign up for the unaffiliated newsletter to find out what Fish and I are doing every week. Thanks again to our sponsors, Aponte and Busam. And we hope to see you at the next Colorado Sun political event. We'll be back soon. And thank you so much to our panelists. You guys are awesome. That was fun. Enjoy your vacations.